Everyone, Ollie here, and this is my review of part 13 to 14 of Trial of a Time Lord, which is entitled The Ultimate Foe. The fourth and final story of the 23rd season of classic Doctor Who, starring Colin Baker and his final regular appearance as the Sixth Doctor. The Ultimate Foe is a 147 story rule, is 2 parts long, and part 13 was written by Robert Holmes, as he died before being able to complete a final draft of the final part, and part 14 was eventually written by Pip and Jane Baker. So the plot of this story is as follows. The Doctor has tried to prove his innocence, but the Valiant is certain of his guilt and will stop at nothing to carry out a sentence of death. But there is a surprise witness waiting in the rings, one who knows the truth. With the trial in disarray, the Doctor flees into the Matrix to confront his enemy, into a nightmarish world of torture and punishment. Trapped within, he will have to fight for his life to face it against the Ultimate Foe. So that is the plot of The Ultimate Foe. And I think that The Ultimate Foe was a pretty good story. Despite it almost not happening, the chances of Niv failing being very high, but it managed to deliver despite the behind the scenes politics that really hindered the making of the season, pretty much peaking at this point during the making of the story. And the production of the story, wow. The fact that John Nathan Turner and the cast and crew were able to actually get the story completed on time was nothing short of a miracle. So going to the back and forth into this story, Robert Holmes had pretty much completed the draft of part 13 slash part 1 of the story and it was ready to be used, but part 14 was pretty much incomplete. Please, as he unfortunately passed away, but then he pretty much had like a guideline which saw and the ending saw the Doctor and the Valiard fall into some sort of time vent with no way out whatsoever, and that's how the story would have pretty much ended. And Eric Saywood, who was actually convinced by Holmes's widow to actually return to the show and pretty much complete his vision. But then John Nathan didn't actually want to use this ending because he thought that it would give the BBC enough fuel to cancel Doctor Who with having a very ambiguous ending. And so this was pretty much the last straw for Eric Saywood, and that's why he decided to pretty much ultimately resign after the making of the story, and shortly afterwards he pretty much slagged off John Nathan Turner and the casting of Colin Baker in an interview shortly after the season. And in that interview, he actually named Vengeance Virus a comedy, which was quite weird. So, because of Eric Saywood quitting and taking the original Part 14 with him, Pip and Jane Baker pretty much had to write Part 14 on their own without seeing a single aspect from the original Part 14, and they pretty much had to use Robert Holmes' Part 13 as a guideline, as such, and they only had like a few days to write it, and they had like a lawyer who was pretty much watching over the writing to make sure nothing from Robert Holmes' Part 14 was actually used. And I think Eric Saywood actually wanted to get Part 13, his own Part 13 removed, but then he wasn't able to. And obviously, Saywood said that if it was used or any way, shape, or form, he would actually sue John Nathan Turner and the BBC. Despite all the creative drama, the sets looked quite cool, especially inside the Matrix, which had the fantasy factory surrounded in a black sky, which shows how dark the story is. You can even tell, like, from the motif of the DVD cover, it is very, very dark, so to speak. The script was actually quite good, and the direction by Chris Clow was actually quite good as well. And this is the last story to feature the 1984 opening, so it's another end of an era as such. The plot, although very scattered and all over the place, with the drama regarding to John Nathan Turner and Eric Saywood, it was actually quite interesting, and it is definitely one of the more interesting finales that Doctor has had in years, especially how it pretty much addresses the Doctor's own morality and his own role in the universe, and what would potentially happen if the Doctor abandoned those morals. Though the plot does take a lot of elements from The Deadly Assassin, another Robert Holmes story, it actually worked and explained the overall plot, which I'll get into shortly, and I like how it pretty much wraps up things nicely and allows Doctor Who to continue for at least another couple of years. Although it leaves another mystery at the end that never actually gets answered, on TV anyways. So we finally found out the reason as to why the Doctor is on trial, and as I said before, it is pretty much based on The Deadly Assassin, so think of about that if you do remember it, but I'll explain it, don't worry. So, the main reason why the Doctor's on trial, because it mainly had to do with the events of what happened on the mysterious planet, and the Master shows up in the Matrix and reveals that the secrets of the Matrix had been stolen by the Sleepers in Ravolox, as we know was Earth, but then it was as if they were going to make some sort of profit from it, as Glitz said that it could make the Sleepers a lot of money. And the Time Lords find out about this, and they pretty much decided to send the Earth millions of light years away using something called magnetron, which nearly destroyed the planet, and because of the fireballs it had caused, and that's how pretty much it all became scattered, and the Time Lords decided to rename Earth as Ravolox in order to try and cover up their own interference. And the High Council wanted to persecute the Doctor and use him as a scapegoat by hiring the Valar to do this, to make it out as if that he was responsible for what was going on there. I think this was pretty much the last straw for the Doctor to pretty much denounce the Time Lords and just tell them off. But then obviously the Valiard pretty much betrays the Time Lord High Council, and because he has his own sort of he has his own MO, so that pretty much causes things which become more problematic for the trial, and decided to do so by manipulating a great deal of what happened in the Doctor's evidence in the Matrix by manipulating Perry's death, which is revealed that she actually didn't actually die. She was actually survived and decided to marry King Akronos and spend the rest of her days with him. I did like how it pretty much fixes how hasty her death was, as this is John Nathan Turner's doing, because he wanted to try and move away from the violent reputation the Doctor Who was getting, and as such. So, plus you don't have to enjoy the image of a bald Perry getting killed, but with that being the last image of her seeing her. I like it, but Nicola Brown might not see it that way. I liked how the plot revelation was. I liked how it was handled and what happened afterwards. And even though I'm not a bigger fan of the stories that Pip and Jean Baker have actually written for Doctor Who, but this one they actually managed to pull through, despite, well, in part 14 anyways. I did like how they were able to pretty much pull through part 14, even though there was a very major change in tone. But it's a really good thing because I think their version was still quite faulty. Was actually what redeemed this season in a way. But I do have to give credit for Eric Saywood for pretty much trying to capture what Robert Holmes was looking for in part 13. But I do think because of part 14, this allowed Doctor Who to at least run for at least another 3 years. Although the BBC didn't actually see it that way in the late 80s, unfortunately. But as I said before, the tones was quite different because part 13 was quite dramatic and very serious, and part 14, the dramatic tension pretty much slows down and it's decided to become a bit more lighthearted, and it is a bit of a jarring change, but it's okay to be honest, because it's an alright change to be honest. Yes, but I think part 14 was able to capture what Doctor Who was really about. The Doctor's faith in their companions, and how the Doctor's faith pretty much drives them to save the day and stop evil, and pretty much looked at the show in a long term perspective. Whereas Holmes, although I do have respect for his writing, including part 13, I do think part 14, his version of part 14, was way too risky. Pretty much, especially with the landscape of BBC pretty much wanted to prove the Doctor Who is failing, and having it end in such a very dramatic change, in a very dramatic ending, was just. I definitely think the BBC would have actually ended Doctor Who there, because if you think of what happened to Blake 7 and how that ended, it was just very. Yeah. So it's a good thing that John Nathan Turner didn't actually go on to making that change. So on to the moments, which I thought were quite brilliant. Once again, we do see the stunning computer effect being used for the story, as it showed how the two pods that brought Glitzinger into the space station at the start of the story, the same way the TARDIS was brought in. And I do like the Doctor's speech when he's pretty much ripping it into the timeless in regards to the truth and why he was on trial. It was very scathing, and I think that's definitely one of Colin Baker's defining moments as the Doctor. And I think the part 13 cliffhanger was quite interesting, and it was quite chilling as well. And this is when the Doctor was getting dragged down like quicksand, and whilst in the Matrix, and the Valar are just somewhere just mocking him and laughing him. Although the ending of that was just a bit weird, how that resolved was a bit weird, because you pretty much he gets submerged and Sablon Glip shows up and the Doctor just pretty much rises up in the quicksand. And I also think that there are other impressive moments as well, such as Mo running into the Matrix to save the Doctor from execution and the Valiard's defeat towards the end. And the Doctor learning about Perry not being dead and the ending of the story, which revealed that the Valiant had actually escaped and was not actually dead, and that was a very good ending, giving us more aspects to more stories, not televised though. And the performances, which I think were very strong. Colin Baker did an excellent job here. I do think that this is his best televised performance as the Sixth Doctor, and even Baker said himself that this is one of his favourite stories that he's filmed. Understandably furious by being put into another sham trial, which is at the doing of another doing of the Time Lords, through their own duplicitous means, again coming at his own expense again. But the Time Lords here seem to realize that what he did was wrong, and he realizes how severe the situation was, especially how what the Velad wants to do by pretty much killing every single Time Lord. I did like how he seemingly accepted the count of genocide that was on his way to get executed, but Mel pretty much comes in and saves the Doctor, but then it turns out that he knew it was an illusion, and because he knew this because Mel wasn't actually present when the Doctor had actually admitted the genocide count. And that was a scene I thought was actually acted very well, and I actually liked the scene when the Inquisitor told him that Perry hadn't actually died, and she was pretty much with King Akronos. I did like the little smile that the Doctor gave after he was told it. The Doctor was very relieved to hear that, and obviously shows how close the Doctor and Perry were. Well, and I do think that Colin Baker does have very good chemistry with Michael J. Stone, and it does show the contrast between the Doctor and the Valiant, and which shows how tense the story was at times and how dastardly the Valiant was, considering the fact now that his secret's in the open and we now know who the Valiant is. Though this ended up being Colin Baker's final story, he doesn't regenerate here, but he ends up getting fired by the BBC because they thought that he was just a complete failure and they wanted to start afresh. Although he was actually asked to come back for one story, I think that was Tam and the Rani, but at the time it was actually called Strange Matter, which he was supposed to have regenerated them, but then Colin Baker wanted to do at least one more season, but then the BBC thought that the 18-month hiatus counted as a season, which was just fucking bullshit anyway, so I don't know why they thought that. So Colin Baker decided to refuse to come back and film a proper regeneration story, but he said he actually regretted doing so, because fans missed out on the opportunity. But I think there is a big finished story out there which actually explains how the Sixth Doctor actually regenerated. Bonnie Langford did a great job here as well, and I actually think that this is her best performance as Mel so far. Well, probably her best performance as Mel in this tenure during the TARDIS. Though with Mel, there's a noticeable difference in her writing in parts 13 and 14, as in part 13, Robert Holmes' version, she was actually completed by Saywood, she was pretty much in the background in the courtroom for the entirety of that part, because Saywood actually disliked Mel and pretty much had Glitz in the role of the de facto companion. But in part 14, Pip and Jane actually put Mel into the companion position, and she's actually put the decision. I think that was a very good call to make, because she actually does run into the Matrix in an attempt to save the Doctor and pretty much stays with him for a good chunk of that, because I think it does pretty much give Mel some character of some sorts. Though she does mess up the Doctor's plans so he can confront the Valiard, but I do think that having Mel do that made her quite badass, even though she was stripped by the Keeper of the Keys earlier. But I do think that her running into the Matrix to save the Doctor was very ballsy, and I don't think any other companion would have actually done this. So it was still a very good scene. Linda Bellingham does a good job here, and the Inquisitor is now featured more into the plot, as the twists and turns of the trial and the Master hijacking the Matrix was able to broadcast the entire trial on Gallifrey, which pretty much causes riots in Gallifrey. She definitely does become very concerned, but unfortunately all she can do is just basically watch, and she is grateful when the Doctor is able to save the day and becomes more pleasant towards him, and even attempts to encourage him to run for Lord President. But the Doctor suggests that she runs, because the Doctor would not ever do that. even to the end before thanking the doctor, I did like how she remained impartial throughout. So I do think she was secretly on the doctor's side throughout the most of the trial, but she obviously had to remain impartial. So onto the side cast. There weren't many, but we only had three notable characters. First off, we have Sabalon Glitz. Last seen in Mysterious Planet, he alongside Mo were brought into the court by the Master to exonerate the Doctor. He aids the Doctor in part 13, but in part 14, he randomly decides to side with the Master, although he don't think he really bared any ill will towards the Doctor. Though there was a scene where they pretty much froze the Doctor inside the Master's TARDIS, and that's how they decided to work together. So he and the Master decided to team up together so they can try and sell the secrets of the Matrix for profits themselves. But then they're pretty much stopped by before the end. But then once the day is saved, and then the Doctor and the Master and Glitz were still pretty much trapped in the destroyed Matrix, the Doctor actually asked the Time Lords to be lenient towards Glitz. And I think there was a scene I actually quite liked when the Master was trying to hypnotize Glitz, but then he wasn't working because Glitz was pretty much probably thinking how much money he can make off the coin he's being hypnotized with. So I think Tony Selby did a very good job in this story, and I think this is definitely one of his best stories as Glitz. Then we also have the Keeper of the Matrix. He's, as it says in the tin, he's pretty much responsible for the Matrix, and he even prevents Miller entering it at the start of during part 14 when he trips her. But at the end, he's seemingly replaced by the Valiant, who somehow survives. And then lastly, you have Popplewick. He was a clerk in the Fantasy Factory, and he was a so-called associate of J.J. Chambers, but he was actually the Valiant in disguise the whole time. So, on to the villains of the story. First off, we have the Master. Although the Master isn't as villainous here as he was in other stories, as he actually wanted to help the Doctor in clearing his name, although the Master had his own reasons for doing so. He does this by bringing in Mel and Glitz into the courtroom to try and testify on the Doctor's behalf, and then he tells the court that the Matrix had been tampered with, and the Master was actually inside the Matrix as he had his own copy of the keys of the Matrix. And he revealed why the Doctor was actually being trialed, Perry actually surviving, and the true identity of the Valiard. Although he doesn't actually care about the Doctor and the Valiard destroying them, pretty much killing each other, but he was quite concerned about the Valiard and wanted the Doctor dead himself, but he wanted to be the one to kill the Doctor, not the Valiard. But he doesn't really care about the outcome, so he's more focused on teaming with Glitz and telling the Matrix the secrets of the Matrix, and taking control of Gallifrey with all faith lost in the High Council and the Doctor disposed. But the Valiard pretty much stopped the Master in doing this and has his own plan for Gallifrey taken over by the Valiard. So, as I said before, the Master is in the Matrix for pretty much most of the story, and appears in the Matrix to address the court, and appears inside the Matrix with Glitz to try and come up with their own plans. And I assume that the Master kept his own keys from when he had control of the Matrix and did the assassin. Anthony Ainley was quite good here, but his appearance kind of felt shoehorned in order to try and have the Master appear in every single story annually. So it was a nice way to have him explain what happened. And as I said before, the Master and Glitz were stopped, and they were pretty much stuck in the Matrix, and the Master was pretty much let go because the Doctor said you can do pretty much whatever you want with him. And the next time we will actually see the Master will be the last ever story of classic Doctor Who, which will be Survival. So this will be Anthony Ainley's last appearance of the Master for a good bit. And now I'll finally talk about the Valiard, the big bad of the season. The truth is out, and it's revealed by the Master that the Valiard is the Doctor. Well, you probably know this, but yeah, the Valiard is the Doctor. Well, a darker manifestation of the Doctor, placed between the Doctor's 12th and 13th generations, and was hired by the Time Lords to deal with the Doctor, and this causes a great big brouhaha in the courtroom, and that's how the Valiard escapes into the Matrix. The Master does not like the Valiard one bit, as he is basically the Doctor, but minus the morals, which makes things scary for the Master, and that's how he wanted both of them dead, but doesn't care how either of them do it. And obviously the Master wants to be the one to stop the Doctor himself, not the Valiard. And so after the Valar had taken over had the Master's original plan to take over Gallifrey, he actually wanted to kill every single Time Lord, which I think is pretty much an extreme version of the Doctor, who doesn't really like the Time Lords, and the Valiard, who doesn't like the Time Lords, pretty much wants them dead, so to speak. And I think Michael Jason was brilliant here, and I love how he is able to play a very twisted version of the Doctor we all know and love. He is still very much the same Doctor. He does, as they do share some of the oddities and quirks and whatnot, such as quoting Shakespeare, but his resentment for the Time Lords is pretty much turned to levels of genocide. Right, and how he just callously dismisses the Master by even failing to acknowledge him, and even goes as far as hijacking the Master's plans for Gallifrey. That just shows how evil the Valiard is, and how he pretty much is the Doctor minus the morals that the Doctor pretty much makes makes the Doctor a good person in a sense. Though I think this is actually one of the first times that the Doctor's own morals is actually explicitly mentioned in this story, and what would happen if the Doctor had actually abandoned these morals. And even though the Doctor does pride themselves and him especially themselves as being a good person, but although this is addressed several times in the show, even especially in New Who, but I think it's definitely put into the spotlight here. The Doctor, yes, the Doctor does seem like a good person who goes out of their way to try and save the universe and save planets and civilizations, but it's what the Doctor kind of does to save the day. Does this make the Doctor a good person, considering the fact that how the Doctor here pretty much kills the Vervoids and genocidal, and pretty much causes the Valiant to accuse the Doctor of committing genocide? You have to kind of think back on other stuff the Doctor's done as well, especially the killing Shocker in the Two Doctors, or even thinking back to the Seat of Death, how the Doctor pretty much sent the Ice Warriors to death by pretty much sent by hijacking their rockets and sending them to the sun. Yeah, there are definitely other examples I can definitely think of, but it does make you think, is the Doctor a really good person? So I do like how that was pretty much explored, and how the Valiard is pretty much there, and how it pretty much explains what the Doctor could be if he was evil. So if the Matrix damage, it's assumed that the Valiant was dead, because with the Doctor pretty much found all the names of the Time Lords in the courtroom, he pretty much wanted to kill and replace them all, but it turns out that he had survived and was wearing the Keeper's robes. So on to the faults of the story. The main one being that the tone for both stories feel very different to one another, and of course, Part 13 had higher stakes that are usually found in Robert Holmes, Eric Hayward stories, but Part 14 had a lot of the dramatic elements died down in favor of some comedic elements found in the Pip and Jane Baker stories, such as the big fancy word usage, which was just annoying, so to speak, just to make the script look smart and seem a bit more camp and fancy. Although it was a weird change, but oddly enough, it worked for the story, and I do feel like the story does feel a bit incomplete, probably due to Part 14 having a lot of scenes removed, and funnily enough, the completed version actually overran for like 40 minutes, and John Nathan Turner was able to cut it down to at least a good 30. Although I feel like Part 13 actually did have some things cut as well, but some was needed, for example, because I think there was a deleted scene when the Master was pretty much loving every insult Mel was just pretty much calling him as you're evil, you're despicable, and the Master was just lapping it up. No. And lastly, I do think the extended Part 14 could have actually had some scenes removed, as the padding was quite noticeable. So, now we bid farewell to the Sixth Doctor, as his era unfortunately ends very prematurely. When he returned to the TARDIS with Mel, that will be the last time we will see Colin Baker on screen as the Sixth Doctor, as his regular appearance. So he does appear in Dimensions in Time, and several years later he does actually appear in the Centenary special. And his last words were carrot juice, carrot juice, carrot juice. He doesn't regenerate until the end, until this opening scene of the following season. As I said before, the BBC decided to blame Colin Baker for this season for his era failing, without actually blaming John Nathan Turner and Eric Sayward. But then I also said that they actually counted the 18-month hiatus as a season, which was just completely unfair. And I do think that the writing was definitely set up Paul Cullen to fail, and I don't think that's his fault at all. So I think during the production of season 20, I think other than the writing, I do think that Michael Grade was just pretty much actively trying to get rid of Doctor Who in any way, shape, or form. And so obviously, as I said before, they actually wanted to bring him back for at least one to film his final regeneration story, but Colin Baker actually rightfully declined. Like, I actually agree, because you pretty much are being accused of causing the show to fail, even though it's not your fault as well. You're just pretty much learning the lines and following the directions of the script editors and the directors or whatnot, and you're being blamed for just doing your job. I honestly think that's bullshit, and Colin Baker really deserved better. But and then I do agree with him declining this, even though he actually did regret doing so because of the fans. But yeah. So I do think Colin Baker was a very good Doctor, and he actually did try his best with the shoddy writing he was given, and he always stood out. Though having his character unlikable at the start was a very questionable idea, but he undergoes some development as he's a lot less smug and more considerate towards others. And I honestly have to give a hand to Big Finish for saving the Sixth Doctor and making him pretty much turning his character into complete 180 as he was on TV. I listened to a few Big Finish stories, such as The Holy Terror and Doctor Who and the Pirates, and the Sixth Doctor is nothing like how he was on TV. As the Doctor's more charming, he's more considerate, and he's definitely more on the case on trying to save the day, as we saw in Trial of the Time Lord. And I admire the fact that because of Big Finish, they actually give the Sixth Doctor a proper regeneration story in which he has another final showdown of the Valiard. And it explains how the Doctor actually regenerates, not that shitty regeneration course, but just having him bang headed against the TARDIS console. Although many fans back then really disliked the Colin Baker era, and I do think that some fans are kind of warming to his era now, and I do think that the Sixth Doctor's era is pretty much a cautionary tale of writing Doctor Who when things become too convoluted, having a Doctor that's very difficult to connect with, or just having a lot of continuity that you're pretty much having to have fans rely on to remember to try and build the story, which is quite tricky, so to speak. But to be honest, I always like the Sixth Doctor, even though he is on my rankings of classic Doctors. He does pretty much appear full at the end, but it's obviously because of the writing having his era being so short. But yeah, I do think Colin Baker deserved to have at least a longer tenure in the TARDIS, and yeah, I do think that his era is just criminally short. So to conclude, I think the Ultimate Four pretty much wraps things for Trial of the Time Lord in a very good way, and exploring who the Doctor could possibly be, and the Doctor's actions and the Doctor's decisions, and what would the moralist Doctors be like. And also having completed the story of the whole drama about Robert Holmes and Eric Sayward, whatever. You know, I do think that was a very good choice. It was a very good job in how having completing the story just in time for getting this on air and having Doctor Who airing for at least another couple of years. So it is definitely a big achievement, and the faults I do really hinder the story, but yeah, so I give the Ultimate Phone 8 out of 10. So that is a wrap for the Colin Baker era. Join me next time as I rank all 4 stories of Trial of the Time Lord. So thanks for watching. Please let me know what you thought of this story and this review. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Until then, see you later.